day, and welcome to another session of the Public Intellectual Lecture Series. I am Leo from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, and today's session involves economics and the Philippines. How far have we gone under the Duterte regime? We have here for today's guest, Sonny Africa, the Executive Director of Ibon Foundation, a nonprofit research and advocacy group. Thank you very much, Sonny, for accommodating us for today's session.
Thank you for the invitation, Leo. I can share something.
Yes. Of course, this will be a very interesting discussion because apparently, the claims from both the opposition and those who support the government differ, but we're talking about the same reality. So the topic for today is about economics. So perhaps you can provide us a brief overview of the economic condition of the Philippines, right? The economic situation. Because on one hand, you have the government or government data even saying that there's economic growth, a 6.6 increase or 6.6 economic growth for the past 2 years. And then you have also the supporters of the government claiming that the various tax reform packages have actually been geared towards uplifting the lives of the poor. And then on the other, you have critics saying that it has not really impacted the lives of those whose lives need to be uplifted. Perhaps you can talk or perhaps give us an overview regarding that discussion.
The thing about the economy, of course, there's so many figures you can throw around. But for us, what really matters is we have to look at the figures that matter to people's lives. So I think the fact of economic growth, it's true. I mean, it's a statistical fact that the economy has been growing. It's also a statistical fact the economy has been growing more rapidly in the last, more or less the last 5 to 10 years compared to previous decades. But also, it's a statistical fact the economy is not creating enough jobs and the number of poor people are increasing. So for us, it's not actually a question of who's saying what's factual or not, what's true or not. It's actually choosing what fact matters for us when we assess the economy. So for us, we will grant that the economy has been growing. We will grant that it has been growing at the most rapid rate in maybe like 3 to 4 decades. But I think people who hold on to facts have to accept the fact the economy is creating less jobs now than before. The fact is also there are more poor people now than in the country's history. So for us, I think let's not look for single figures about the economy to say that's the state of the economy. Let's look for the most important figures about the state of the people, and that's what the economy is about. Because in the end, growth does not mean anything if the people aren't feeling it. And right now, I think the sad reality is, despite the growth, the people are not feeling economic growth. Some people are getting very, very wealthy. They're probably the ones who are quite happy to talk about economic growth because it reflects increasing profits, increasing wealth. But that is not the state of the economy.
But that's the point. Now, how do we reconcile that contradiction? Because on one hand, you said it's an objective reality, a statistical reality, that there is an increase in there's an increase in growth, there's an increase in, you mentioned something about, I think, certain or growth being increased. And then on the other, what you're also saying, it's also an objective reality that people do not have jobs, or there's an increasing rate in people not having jobs, or not having an adequate quality of life. Perhaps we can start this discussion, because that's a very loaded question, I think. But let's start with that, with an explanation of why, for example, the economy is booming, or there's wealth is being generated, or a lot of wealth is being generated.
Actually, there is no contradiction. There's only a contradiction if we hold on to the assumption that an economy automatically reflects the conditions of the people. I'm saying this is a contradiction because the economy is doing what it's doing by design. And that's actually where the problem lies. In principle, an economy should serve the needs of the greatest number. That's what we all believe. That's what people who talk about economic development like to believe. But if it seems like there's a contradiction between growth and underdevelopment, that contradiction disappears once we accept the brutal fact the economy is not designed for the people. The way the economy is structured right now, it's a very elite-driven, elite-dominated economy. We have a political system making economic policy decisions for the interests of a few, for the interests of the wealthy, versus the interests of the many. So the reason I'm saying that's not a contradiction, because by design, when you're talking about a free market economy that's unregulated, we're talking about economic policies that prioritize profits and the market over the needs of the many, what we will have is what is happening right now, which is not contradictory. It's a natural result of an economy that's relies on the unregulated free market. And I think that's such an important point to grasp, because it's not just a matter of let's have faster growth and then we will have more development. If the economy is designed that growth is not going to go to the many, no matter how fast your growth is, it is by design going to concentrate wealth and profits in a few while not creating enough jobs and relieving poverty, because that is not the objective of current economic policy right now. So that's a long-winded way of saying there's no contradiction, because the economy is unfortunately designed for a few, not designed for the many. So for us, it's a political question. I don't think we're living in much of a democracy right now. We can't have a political democracy if there's lack of democracy in the economy. And if there's no democracy in the economy, we'll have political decision-making for the interests of a few, leading to the seeming contradiction, but actually intrinsic outcome of an undemocratic economy.
But again, no, because you're mentioning the free market, no, you're mentioning this laissez-faire point of view that everyone should be able to have the opportunity to compete, and it should be sort of like a functional meritocracy, you know, where the fittest can actually survive, or the most competent can actually survive. No? But the point there is, shouldn't the government be regulating these things? No? Because as the Duterte government has proclaimed, that the train law, the tax reform law, should actually impact the poor rather than the rich. And that's what the government is also saying. The train law is actually impacting positively growth and also inclusivity, because now most of the government should now be able to accumulate funds to impact the lives of the poor. No? So why is that? Because what if that's the problem with the system? What is the government doing to regulate that system, or at least to fix that system?
That's a good specific example, the train law. First, it's not true that the train law is helping economic growth and helping development. If anything, the train law is designed to transfer wealth from the poorest to the richest. And that is by design. What does the train law do? Train Package 1 reduced personal income taxes on the richest families. By our estimation, the top 20% of wealthiest families in the Philippines will be paying less personal income tax. Because the government needs revenue, the reduction in revenues from lowering personal income tax on the richest is made up for by increasing consumption taxes on everyone, including the poorest 80%. So the net effect is the richest 20%, they are paying higher consumption taxes, but they get more in their pocket from lower personal income taxes, that in the end, they have more money in their pocket. The problem is with the poorest 80%, they are paying higher consumption taxes, but with no offsetting gains in personal income tax. So the net effect for the poorest 80%, they have less money in their pocket. So overall, what is happening is you're transferring wealth from the poorest 80% to the richest 20%. And that is by design. So for us, again, we were talking earlier about what facts are in place. Unfortunately, the train law is a good example of government economic managers not actually being very truthful. They keep saying that 99% of Filipino households will benefit from the train law. That actually is a brazen untruth, because we have their own data, which they presented in Senate committee hearings, which they gave to us as part of our formal data requests. They knew that the burden of the train law would fall on the poorest. They knew the train law would liberate the richest families, but they said something contrary to that. So for us, that's an untruth. And again, it cuts to the heart of the matter. The train law is just a very specific data point about economic policy making. This is an economic policy designed for the wealthy at the expense of the poorest. And that cuts across wage policy, land reform policy, trade and investment policy. Unfortunately, the underlying spirit of our economic policy is to make things better for the richest, even if it tramples on the interests of the many.
So, given that obviously by design, the train law is actually taxing the poor more rather than the rich. No? But wouldn't the logic also there, or wouldn't the government logic also there apply that they're trying to follow like a Keynesian model where the government accumulates funds so it can stimulate, or they can actually create more jobs. So for example, I think part of the funding that's coming from or part of the funds that come from the train law will actually be utilized for the build program. No? So if you're following that train of logic, no, So even if the poor is actually paying more, aren't they getting more from that particular law, because the government will now move towards providing more jobs for them?
Again, unfortunately, that is not what's going to happen. If the train law is meant to be funding infrastructure, let's focus on the flagship infrastructure projects. There are 75 flagship infrastructure projects right now by the government. About 90% of those are transport projects. About 2/3 of those are in the country's richest regions, National Capital Region, Central Luzon, and Southern Tagalog. So at a stroke, that belies the argument that the train loss revenues, which go to infrastructure, will go to the poor. Because train law will be funding infrastructure projects concentrated in the 3 wealthiest regions of the country, not trickling down to the remaining 12, 13 regions of the country. So it can't be called a pro-poor infrastructure spending if it's being spent mainly in the country's richest regions. Secondly, in all honesty, the poor don't need more roads. Who needs more roads? The companies based in NCR, CL, and ST who need more mobility for their goods and services, to go to the port area, to send their goods abroad, or to bring goods into their export zones. They're going to be the main beneficiaries of the train law. So I know it's always nice to have infrastructure. It's always nice to feel that you have a quicker commute. But our problem there is that infrastructure spending is not commensurate to the benefits, and infrastructure spending will be financed by regressive tax reform package, which is the train law. So it's a complete untruth. The government says that the revenues will be spent on proper infrastructure. That is not happening.
But you mentioned it specifically because farm to market roads are sort of like part of this package or part of the infrastructure package offered by the Duterte government. No? You also mentioned Central Luzon and Southern Tagalog. No? Because I was thinking about the recent events regarding farmers. No? Apparently, there's a contradiction between what the government wants for food supply and the condition of farmers. No? Wouldn't infrastructure or farm-to-market roads from Central Luzon to NCR and Southern Tagalog to NCR, no? And even from other regions in Mindanao to Davao, no? As the port areas, no? Wouldn't these actually contribute to alleviating or actually improving the lives of farmers? No? Isn't that part of the government framework?
Actually, again, another good example, the rice liberalization law, well, sometimes called the rice tarification law. The rice liberalization law, it took away protections for rice for domestic rice industry. So it took away import quotas, it took away the regulatory authority of the National Food Authority, and it opened up the country to basically unlimited rice imports as long as certain tariffs are paid. It's basically opening up the country to cheap rice imports. Again, it's by design. The way the free market operates is it kills the poor. It kills the uncompetitive who tend to be the poorest. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Because of the rice liberalization law, in Central Luzon, even if you have more farm-to-market roads, farmers will still not be able to compete because they have not felt the subsidies to become more efficient, to become more competitive. Yet right now, because of the rice liberalization law, they're having to compete with cheap imported rice from Thailand, from Vietnam, and India, which are heavily subsidized in their home countries. And what is happening is exactly what's happening now. The way the market operates is you have cheap rice from abroad. It drives local palay prices down. Rice traders will not get any more from the local rice farmers. They will buy from abroad, driving palay prices down, driving farmers' incomes down, forcing rice farmers to go bankrupt, forcing rice farmers to find other means of livelihood because it's no longer profitable or commensurate to their effort to produce rice. Hence, they will produce less rice or they will stop farming rice. They might go to construction for short-term jobs. You have two major long-term effects. Domestic rice production will collapse. Rice farmers will be displaced and they're earning like maybe 6,000, 7,000 pesos a month right now. That's nothing. And third, the country's food security over the long term will be compromised and we're forced to rely on imported rice. So on so many levels, the free market operating in the rice industry, again, it's emblematic. It hits the poor the worst. It makes the rice traders very wealthy because they can now have markups on their larger markups on the rice they sell. But long-term development and short-term welfare of farmers is completely compromised because the free market is operating. So against that, any claim that but they have they have farm-to-market roads, it's not enough. What they need is what Thai rice farmers, Vietnamese rice farmers, Indian rice farmers, and actually Japanese rice farmers are getting. There's a lot of talk about the Rice Competitiveness Enhancement Fund. It's supposed to be 10 billion pesos a year. That is nothing compared to what Vietnamese farmers are earning. Vietnamese farmers are getting over $1 billion in subsidies every year. Thai farmers are getting over $4 billion in rice subsidies every year. Japanese rice farmers are getting over $16 billion in rice subsidies every year. And that's the kind of support rice farmers need. Infrastructure won't help them. Rice civilization will devastate them.
That's a good point. But I know this is a very harsh point of view, but isn't that proof that the laissez-faire concept works? Because you're now driving, or you're now producing, or you have now access to cheaper rice, which benefits consumers. And now on the other, if farming or agriculture is no longer viable for farmers, they now can move on, because that's the promise, diba? You can now move on. You can now migrate to the city and acquire higher paying jobs. No? I know there's an issue on the long term when it comes to food security, but again, from the point of view of the individual consumer, and maybe the government can argue the peasant, they can now move on to more economically rewarding activities. No?
I think it's nice to unpack some seemingly intuitive notions there. I'll work backwards. First intuitive notion, okay, it's not profitable to farm. I'll move to the cities for higher paying jobs.
Because that's how laissez-faire works. Diba?
That is not happening. Why? The highest unemployment rates in the country are in the cities. The worst urban living conditions are in our city-urban centers. They're congested, they're polluted, they're the social problems of crime and everything. So we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion a farmer who loses work will have options in the city, because they won't have options in the city. We have a bloated informal sector with very low-paying, insecure informal work. They will not earn more in the cities. They will just bloat the informal sector. They will bloat urban unemployment. So that's, I think, a completely dodgy thing to claim that a displaced farmer has options in the city, because there are not enough options in the city. Second point, is it okay for inefficient farming to just let it die and then let the economy move in a certain
allegedly
way?
The capitalist system is a self-correcting, self-regulating system. No?
Again, we have to unpack that, because there is a prime of place that should be given to food self-sufficiency. And it's an insight that our neighbors, ironically, where we're getting rice from, they realized. They realized if they let the free market operate in the Thai, Vietnamese, Indian, Japanese rice industry, they know if the free market operates, those industries, those sectors will collapse. So they made a political choice to subvert the market for a development end of rice self-sufficiency. They're subsidizing their rice farmers, because if they were not subsidized, the market would kill them. But there's a political decision. We want a rice industry, even if the market says inefficient. And on balance, what's more important? What the market says or what economic development demands? The political choice should be what economic development demands.
What people need.
It's a wrong political choice to deify the market and say, whatever the market says, that's the way to go. The market in the rice industry will say, let it die, import it cheaply from abroad at the expense of short-term transition costs for farmers, at the expense of long-term food self-insufficiency and food insecurity. That's a political decision. And it goes along, it cuts across all realms of economic activity. If, for instance, again, our neighboring countries, Japan, China, if they chose to let the market operate in terms of industrial development, they would not have industries to begin with. They'd remain backward agricultural countries. But at their periods of development, their governments intervened in industrial development to subsidize their industries, to protect their industries, not following what the market says. Hence, they're industrial powerhouses now. So for us, that's such a key concept to grasp. we've gotten so used to thinking that what the market says is going to be correct. It's self-regulating. We've gotten so used to thinking the only activity worth entering into is what's profitable. But that is not the point of the economy. If the point of an economy is to create enough jobs, enough incomes for the population, if the point for an economy, especially an agricultural country, is to have food security for the population, the market will not give that on its own account. The market actually will go in contrary directions. Hence, the government should step in to regulate it in a certain way to bring the economy to development. And that's where I think where the Duterte administration and even past Philippine governments have failed. In the last 4 decades, we've bought into the deification of the market, bought into this celebration of global competitiveness and market efficiency. Worst of all, we've bought into the idea that the government should not intervene in national economic development. It should leave it to the market. And we are where we are right now with growth being very high, but not enough jobs. With a lot of profits for a few wealthy families and big corporations, but with the majority actually still in poverty. That is what the market has delivered. And by any standard, I don't think that's a good development outcome, what the free market has given us over the last 4 decades.
That's actually a very good point. Thank you. Because you were also mentioning about the role of government in ensuring, I guess, competitiveness in a very free market economy driven system. No? But isn't the government also intervening in terms of government services, social services? Because that's also part of the promise of the train law, no? That it's not just about infrastructure, but also providing more for education, health services. And in a way, aren't we seeing it in terms of the free tuition policy for state universities and colleges? Isn't that a byproduct as well of a free market economy where the government actually just taxes people and then returns these its funding into the forms of social service?
Again, let's unpack that a bit. First, social services should never be provided in market terms. So for us, that's a key notion that we have to grasp. Health and education, to some degree even housing, if that's left to the market, they will be too expensive and inaccessible for too many people, because they will become more expensive because there's always going to be a profit premium put on that. So I think a core notion about social services, the people need it. We cannot leave it to the market and privatize it, because if we commodify health and education, only those who can afford it will have it. So that's an important point, because that points to how the government has to, over the long term, be the ones providing in a publicly funded, subsidized manner, health, education, housing, and all of that. So those can't be left to the market. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, where will the government get the resources to provide health education, whether it's universal health care or free tuition and all of that? They should get it exactly from taxation. But should we get it by taxing the poor or taxing the rich? And that's where our problem is with the train law. It's blackmailing the poor to say that you have to pay higher taxes because we're giving it back to you. That's blackmail, because behind that statement that if we don't charge you higher taxes, you won't get your services, behind that statement is you're telling the rich, don't worry, you'll be paying less taxes. And that's where the problem lies. The government has to generate revenues for the social services, but it should be the revenues should be earned from those who have the most ability to pay that, which is the rich. And that is a very problematic notion for us under train law. They are making the rich pay less and making the poor pay more on the argument that it gives social services. That's wrong. The rich should pay more so the poor can have social services. And again, that's a political choice. Redistribution of wealth, public responsibility for the poorest. So it doesn't make sense for us, for the richest families, and with the train package 2 right now, for the biggest corporations, it doesn't make sense for us that those with the most ability to pay will actually end up paying less, and those with the least ability to pay, who will feel every peso they lose, will end up paying more. So again, that's, I think, a key notion. The train law should not be used to blackmail the poor. If anything, the government should make a political choice. Those who have the most should pay the most. Those who have the least should pay the least, or not pay if they can't afford it.
So, because now we're talking about data now, because you're mentioning the train law, and its impact on the economy. While economic data actually shows wealth is being generated, it's not being equitably distributed. No? So it means those who actually have more are getting more, while those who have less pay more for the services that do not necessarily meet the requirements. No, but if that's the case, no, if we're not looking at statistics like GDP, GNP, and if that's the case, how are we supposed to define what is a humane existence? Because obviously that is now being under under interrogation. No? Because what does it really mean to have a livable, humane life? And next, if that is the perspective, what should we really be measuring? What data, what information should we be really looking into and evaluate when determining if there is economic growth, if there is upliftment in the lives of people?
I think human well-being, there's so many dimensions, but to be a bit crude about it, so we can sort of be more manageable, we can talk about the material aspects of human welfare. It's so basic. For human welfare, for a family to have any minimum standard of welfare, their breadwinners have to have jobs, and those jobs have to be secure and giving them enough incomes to provide for the basic needs of daily life. That's one aspect, jobs and incomes. Second aspect, they should have access to decent social services, education, health, and housing. So I think in terms of material needs, jobs with enough incomes and social services. And I think that's where the current administration is actually falling far short. First, we always stress all the time, there's something wrong with the job data being presented right now. First, it's a fact that we're not generating enough jobs. On average, 81,000 annual job generation the first 2 years of the administration. That's the worst job generation in the post-Marcos era. Unemployment is actually much higher than officially reported. The official unemployment rate is about 5.5%. The official number of unemployed is only about 2.3 million. But that's because the government has stopped counting unemployed Filipinos. They made this stricter definition. You had to have been looking for work in the last 6 months and able to start working at the drop of a pin to be counted as unemployed.
I think you need to be looking for work.
Looking for work and immediately available for work. That's so tricky because by putting those two new conditions in the current unemployment statistics, 2.3 million Filipinos are jobless but not counted as unemployed. So that's a problem for us because when that definition was changed in 2005, the government has been using it. It falsely reduces the number of unemployed, falsely reduces the unemployment rate, and giving the impression that growth is benefiting the people. But I think that's so important because it's so normal especially in a market economy. You have to have a job and be earning to actually be buying your basic necessities. So on the jobs front, there's a big problem. We're a service economy more than a producing economy. We're deindustrializing. We're not creating enough jobs because of the free market framework we're doing there. In terms of wages, productivity is actually increasing. Labor productivity has been increasing for the last 2 decades, but wages have not been increasing. Why are wages not increasing? Because they're being taken as profits by the owners of capital. So the economy is growing because productivity is increasing, but the benefits from growth and productivity, they're not going to the workers as higher wages because the real wages have been flat for the last 18 years. They're going to profits. So that's a problem there. Again, inequality and also concentrating wealth on the very richest. So that's where the problem is right now. We have an economy by design not creating enough jobs, an economy by design concentrating income on the very richest, and an economy even worse now by design lowering the tax burden on the richest and increasing the tax burden on the poor. So even the social services we're supposed to be getting, at best, we can call them crumbs because talking about the free tuition, only half of the population, of the student population at the tertiary level is actually going to be benefiting from that. The other half of the tertiary level population will still be in private colleges with very, very high tuition. So it's a good step forward, the free tuition and SUCs, but it's still a partial measure to universal education at the tertiary level. Same goes for universal healthcare. it might seem like a good idea to put money in people's pockets through PhilHealth so they can pay for hospital services. But if those are privately provided hospital services with a profit premium, actually, you're paying more for hospital care than you should be because you added a profit premium because the hospital care is provided by a private firm, like which is profit seeking. So on the social level, that's a problem because health has become a commodity, unnecessarily expensive, instead of being a publicly provided social service provided at cost, or better yet, subsidized. So for us, I think we have to unpack some deeply held things that have been told to us about economic growth, jobs, incomes, and even social services.